Mark Rutte, the current Secretary General and our previous Prime Minister, said that if we don't step up our investments in defense, within 4 or 5 years, we have to learn Russian.
This is delusional. This guy lives on a different planet than I live on. I don't know what to say. I just listen to these people talk and I wonder what world they live in. Just because you're attacked and you're defending yourself doesn't give you the right to execute a genocide. I think you would surely agree with that. Well, the question here
But how do you go after Hamas then?
If you think about the world that Donald Trump is inheriting, I do not envy Donald Trump. He's really enthusiastic about being president again. But if he thinks long and hard about the problems facing him, it's hard to see how he can be anything but categorically depressed.
Hello everybody, my name is Paul Buitink and welcome to the Reinvent Money Show, a podcast about money and power. My co-host today is Wierd Duk, the most influential journalist of the Netherlands, who works for the biggest Dutch newspaper, the Telegraaf. He also used to work as a correspondent in both Russia and Germany. And our guest today is John Mearsheimer, a prominent American political scientist and international relations scholar and professor at the University of Chicago. He's known for developing the theory of offensive realism, and he's also author of many great books, amongst them The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Got it right here. Welcome to the both of you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, John, we recorded a video in April, which has been watched over 1 million times. And in that video, you said things would get worse internationally. You literally had no positive words. You said there was no solution for Gaza at that moment, and the damage would be big for Europe and NATO. I think for the rest of 2024, it played out that way. But right now, with potentially a deal in Ukraine between Trump and Putin and a potential deal between Hamas and Israel, are we about to enter more peaceful times?
Well, I think there's no doubt that at some point the Ukrainian war is going to end. At least the shooting is going to stop. And I think you're going to get a frozen conflict. And that will be a better situation than you have now. But the idea that you're going to get some sort of meaningful settlement, some sort of meaningful peace agreement is not true. And I think the same thing applies to the situation in Gaza. As you know, it looks like we now are on the verge of having a ceasefire in Gaza. But that's not going to put an end to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel and its other neighbors like Hezbollah and Iran. So there's going to be trouble in the Middle East involving Israel and trouble in Ukraine for as far as the eye can see. But just hopefully the shooting will stop in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza will end.
Yeah, so maybe we can then first focus on Ukraine a bit more. Because I was also wondering, why would Russia sign a peace treaty anyway while they're still making progress on the battlefield? Does it make any sense for Putin to sign a deal when the terms are not that favorable for him?
Well, you have to distinguish between a ceasefire and a genuine peace agreement. What the West wants is a ceasefire now. And Putin would be remarkably foolish to agree to a ceasefire now. Because as you pointed out, Paul, the Russians are on the march. They're doing very well. And they don't want to give Ukraine and the West time to reconstitute their forces with a ceasefire and then attack against the Russian forces at some later date. So Putin's not going to agree to a ceasefire, in my opinion. A genuine peace agreement, if the West agreed to the terms that Putin has put on the table, I believe Putin would agree to that peace agreement right away. But the problem is that the terms that Putin has put on the table are at this point in time unacceptable to the West. So the West won't accept it, so Putin won't agree. And I think for the foreseeable future, the fighting will continue.
John, can you elaborate on the terms for the viewers? What would be what would for the West be acceptable?
Well, there are two main terms that Putin insists on before he is even willing to negotiate. And those two terms are, number one, that Ukraine has to be a neutral state, which means it cannot be in NATO. And number two, Ukraine and the West have to recognize the fact that Russia has annexed the four oblasts that it now occupies almost completely, but not completely, and Crimea as well. So what Putin is saying is no Ukraine in NATO, and you have to accept the fact that Ukraine has lost about 1/5 of its territory to Russia.
So you were talking about a frozen conflict. The end of this conflict will be a frozen conflict, in your words. How would this look like?
Well, I think at some point, both sides will agree to stop the fighting, much as happened in Korea in 1953. And there'll be a line of demarcation between the two sides. And you'll have some form of armistice. But it won't be a peace agreement by any means, which is analogous to what you have on the Korean Peninsula. And the real danger here is that, number one, that frozen conflict will turn hot again because the Ukrainians will not be happy with the territory that they've lost, and they'll try to take it back. But furthermore, there are a number of other flashpoints in Eastern Europe that could flare up. The Arctic is one example. The Baltic is a second. Kaliningrad is a third. Moldova is a fourth. Belarus is a fifth. And the Black Sea is a sixth. So you're going to have a frozen conflict in Eastern Europe involving Ukraine. And superimposed on that are going to be these various flashpoints where trouble can start. All of this is to say that Europe is in deep trouble for a long, long time.
Thank you.
The idea that you're going to get some sort of meaningful settlement in Ukraine and everybody's going to live happily ever after is delusional. One cannot underestimate what the catastrophic consequences are of NATO's decision in April 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO. It was a remarkably foolish decision. And then not to stop the war once it started, and number two, not even to try and prevent the war before February 24th, 2022, was remarkably foolish on the part of NATO.
Donald Trump, of course, promised that he will end this war. What do you think about that?
He can't. I mean, it's just empty talk. It's bombast. I mean, as you know, Trump is famous for his pronouncements that have little to do with reality. The idea that he's going to go in and shut this one down is not a serious argument, unless he's willing to concede to the Russians that Ukraine will not be in NATO. There'll be no meaningful security agreements between Ukraine and the West, number one. And two, Trump recognizes that Russia has annexed and should be allowed to keep those four oblasts plus Crimea. I find it hard to imagine Trump doing that. Mm-hmm. But if he does it, then he's going to face all sorts of resistance inside the United States, inside Europe, and from the Ukrainians for sure. Yeah. So he'll be the Lone Ranger on this one. And I don't think he'll get away with it. And this is why I think you're going to get a frozen conflict.
Yeah, because we had Pete Hegseth, the candidate Secretary of Defense, saying that Trump will try to achieve a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine in the most favorable ways for Kiev, which is absolutely not aligned, of course, with Putin's proposal. So he's not going to agree with Putin's proposal. But does it mean that he will then go maybe in overdrive and supply Ukraine with even more weapons and arms than his predecessor did?
He can't. There are no more arms to give. Joe Biden has given all the arms that we have. The Europeans have given all the arms that we have. The Europeans up till now and the Americans up to now are deeply committed to Ukraine. They want Ukraine to win the war. Uh-huh. We've given them everything we can. So it's not like there's this big inventory of weaponry in the back room that Trump can open the closet door and bring out all that weaponry and send it to Ukraine, and it's going to shift the balance. If that weaponry were in the back room, Joe Biden would have gotten it out a long time ago and given it to the Ukrainians, as with the Europeans. It's just not there.
But
And
there's plenty of F-35s.
Pardon?
There are plenty of F-35s and ballistic missiles. And I mean, there's much more, of course, that the US can put to the table.
They can't fly F-35s. We gave them F-16s. They can't fly the F-16s. The F-16s haven't mattered at all. We can give them missiles. We gave them ATACMS. Those ATACMS are basically useless. The idea that the ATACMS are a great war-winning weapon, and thank God we've now given the Ukrainians the ATACMS because they're now going to turn the tide on the battlefield, is not a serious argument. The Ukrainians are destined to lose. They're outgunned, they're outmanned, and they're up against a formidable adversary.
So how will Europe look like if Ukraine would lose this war? Because you said, as you said before, Europe will be in deep trouble.
Well, first of all, it's going to be a huge blow to NATO because NATO, as an institution, is deeply involved in this war, and NATO is going to lose. Furthermore, you have a president of the United States who has nothing but contempt for Europe and would like to put an end to NATO if he could. So the combination of losing in Ukraine coupled with Donald Trump in the White House is real trouble in Europe. Furthermore, this war has done significant damage to Europe. Just look at the German economy. The German economy is in real trouble, and there is no sign of improvement on the horizon. Furthermore, if you look at relations among European countries, you take people like Viktor Orban on one side, and you take various Western European leaders on the other side, what you see is real potential for conflict inside the EU and inside NATO. And furthermore, if you go inside of almost every country in Europe, what you see is a powerful movement toward the right. Nationalist forces are trumping liberal forces, and many of those nationalist forces have sympathetic views towards the Russians. So from a European point of view, I think this is a disastrous situation.
And do you think it's likely that Europe, as a result of everything going on, will unify more, or do you think they will even perhaps go the other way and renationalize? Do you think European Union is sustainable or not?
Well, Europe is renationalizing already. There's no question about that. The question is, how far will it go? I don't think the EU is going away, and I don't think NATO is going away either. But I think both of those institutions are likely to grow increasingly weaker over time, not increasingly stronger. And you want to remember that what makes NATO work is the American presence. The United States runs NATO. You need the United States in NATO to solve all the collective action problems. And as the United States lowers its commitment to NATO and to Europe, which is what Trump wants to do, that makes it harder for NATO to work as an institution. And then there's the EU. The EU depends on NATO for its success because NATO provides security for Europe. And that security enables the EU to flourish. If NATO weakens, and if the Americans were ever to pull out of Europe, and the security situation in Europe were to change drastically, that would have huge consequences on the EU. Because again, the EU flourishes because of NATO. Nobody in Europe admits this, but it's kind of a dirty little secret. But the EU is of secondary importance to NATO, which is of primary importance. I remember a few years ago when the EU won a Nobel Prize for Peace, I said at the time, and I'll say it now, this is ridiculous. The EU should have not gotten the Nobel Prize for Peace. NATO should have gotten the Nobel Prize for Peace. It's NATO, and in particular, the American military presence in Europe. It's the United States acting as a pacifier that provides peace for Europe and keeps the EU flourishing.
But that's very paradoxical because at the same time you say that the crucial mistake that the West made in 2008 was to promise Ukraine NATO membership. Now we have a big war going on in Europe, which actually is harming us economically in many other ways, with high energy costs, etc. So, but that's then the outcome of NATO's actions and words. So it also backfires to be part of NATO, I would say.
I think you're exactly right. Look, the United States decided, and the Europeans, of course, went along in 1994 to expand NATO. That was when the Clinton administration said we're going to expand NATO. The first tranche of expansion was in 1999. This is when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic came in. The second big tranche of NATO expansion was in 2004. This is when the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia came into the alliance. And the key point here is that NATO got away with it. The Russians were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion, both the 1999 and the 2004 tranche. They were adamantly opposed, but they could not do anything to prevent it, and they swallowed it. Then in April 2008, NATO said that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. This was a bridge too far. This was the mistake that NATO made. And of course, in August 2008, this is after the April 2008 decision, in August 2008, you get a war in Georgia. And then in February of 2014, the crisis breaks out in Ukraine. And in February 2022, 8 years later, you actually get a war in Ukraine, which is ongoing now. So it was that April 2008 decision that was the fatal mistake.
John, where the French and the Germans were against, is it?
Absolutely. The Europeans understood, especially the Germans, that it would be a fatal mistake to expand NATO into Ukraine. Angela Merkel has said that the reason that in April 2008 she opposed bringing Ukraine into NATO is that she understood that the Russians, that Putin in particular, would interpret this as a declaration of war. Just think about that.
Which he had said at the Munich conference in 2007, wasn't it, in his speech, that he was warning the West against NATO enlargement.
He was. That's right. But we didn't listen to him. And the Americans, who are principally responsible for this trouble, not the Europeans, the Americans basically refused to accept what Putin, what Merkel, and indeed what Sarkozy said. And we decided we were going to try and push NATO expansion down Russia's throat. We didn't care. The Americans didn't care whether the Russians liked it or not. We were going to make NATO expansion into Ukraine happen. And you see the end result. But the Europeans were opposed. The problem with the Europeans is they won't stand up to the Americans. And this is especially true with the Germans. I, for the life of me, don't understand why the Germans allow the Americans to push them around like this. It's not in the German national interest. But of course, the reason is quite simple. The Europeans are desperate to keep the Americans in Europe. They want to keep the American pacifier intact. And they'll do anything they have to do or think they have to do to keep the Americans happy. But the end result of this, in terms of Ukraine, is you get this massive war that is a total disaster for Europe.
This could change, of course, if AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, would win the Bundestag elections, because Alice Weidel has said that she wants change relations with Russia. Well, they have a totally different concept of the relations with Russia and Ukraine, of course, than the government, which is at the moment. So could this tide change? Do you think, when the nationalist populist parties in Europe will do even better than they are doing at the moment?
You're certainly moving in that direction. But the question is, where does that leave Europe, right? If you have all of these pro-Russian governments sprouting up all over Europe, what does that do to the EU? What does that do to NATO? What does that do to transatlantic relations? I think it's not going to be good. I think the end result is you're going to have a renationalization on a significant scale in Europe. And countries are going to have different relations with the Russians. It's going to make it very difficult to have a common foreign policy. And this is going to have all sorts of negative consequences.
But does the US do the US need a strong, united Europe, or are they fine with having all these bilateral relationships and having a divided Europe? Because if they need a strong Europe, I don't understand why Musk, who's basically the vice president of the US in the future, is trying to stir up all these nationalist sentiments in Europe that could be sort of counterproductive. If Trump wants a strong Europe, why is Musk doing the other thing? Or is Trump also fine with having a divided Europe with potentially a number of countries becoming part of the Russian influence sphere?
Well, first of all, as you know, Trump is not a Russophobe. And in fact, Trump would like the United States to have good relations with Russia. And Trump has great respect for Putin, and Trump would like to have good relations with Putin. So if European countries begin to move in that direction, if the AfD wins in Germany and they foster good relations with Putin, this is not something that's going to anger Trump.
Right.
It may anger the vast majority of Americans in the foreign policy establishment, or the vast majority of individuals in the American foreign policy establishment. But Trump isn't going to care very much. J.D. Vance isn't going to care very much. Musk isn't going to care very much. But the problem is that this is going to cause all sorts of problems across all of Europe. And it's going to cause all sorts of problems for transatlantic relations. This is the problem that you face here.
Yeah. And I guess also if the end game is China, Trump would like to be closer to Russia again and potentially use Russia against China.
Well, my view, as you know, Paul, has been for a long time that the United States should pivot to Asia, and it should pivot away from Europe. You can make a case for keeping NATO intact, keeping a small American presence in Europe. But there's no security threat in Europe that necessitates us being in Europe in a meaningful way, us meaning the United States. We face a real threat in East Asia, and that's China. China is a peer competitor, and we should pivot to Asia. And getting bogged down in a war in Ukraine and getting bogged down in a war in the Middle East is crazy, in my opinion, because it makes it incredibly difficult to deal with East Asia.
Well, Trump seems to agree on this, isn't it? The new administration.
I agree. That's right. I think that's right. And I think you see this, with the ceasefire in Gaza.
Uh-huh.
Trump is very interested in shutting down the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think Trump has no appetite for a war with Iran. I think what he'd like to do is try to restore some sort of stability in the Middle East, make the Middle East look like it looked before October 7th, shut down the war in Ukraine, and instead concentrate on containing China in East Asia. I think in an ideal world, that's what he'd like to do. But the problem that he faces is it's remarkably difficult to shut down the conflicts in the Middle East. And it's remarkably difficult to see how you can get a meaningful peace agreement in Ukraine.
And how can America contain China in the future?
Well, the United States has to pursue a containment policy in East Asia that has two prongs. One is a military prong and the other is an economic prong. And with the military prong, what you do is you build an alliance structure and you try to contain China the way you contained the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And that means you have to put a lot of American military assets in East Asia. You have to work very closely with your allies. And you have to come up with a smart strategy for containing China and at the same time avoiding war. That's the military dimension. But there's also a very important economic dimension. And that is that the United States and China compete in the realm of sophisticated or cutting edge technologies. And there's a great danger that the Chinese will beat the Americans in that competition. This was not a dimension of the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. You didn't have this high-tech competition. In fact, you had two economies that were hardly connected at all. They operated in different worlds. But in the world that we're now in, the Chinese economy and the American economy are interconnected in all sorts of ways, and sophisticated or cutting-edge technologies matter enormously. The country that dominates that world of sophisticated technology, is going to have a great advantage. So the United States is going to great lengths to compete with China and make sure it dominates cutting-edge technologies. So what I'm saying here is that if you talk about the U.S.-China competition, it has a military dimension and it has an economic dimension.
Yeah, so to contain China, we could, for example, the U.S. could keep on supplying weapons to Taiwan and some of the other allies. And I understand from your point of view because China is a peer competitor. But the same doesn't apply then to Russia, because otherwise you would make the same argument about Ukraine. And just like you want to arm Taiwan, you want to arm Ukraine to contain Russia. But you're saying that's a different type of actor which needs different treatment.
Exactly. Russia's not a peer competitor of the United States. Russia is a great power, but it's a weak great power. And where you see this whole line of argument play out is the claim by many in the United States and many in Europe that, number one, Putin is bent on conquering all of Ukraine. And then when he's finished conquering all of Ukraine, he's going to conquer Eastern Europe and he's going to threaten Western Europe. In other words, Putin looks like the Soviet Union, right? Or he looks like Nazi Germany. He's highly aggressive. He's interested in dominating Europe, and therefore we really have to fear him. This is a foolish argument. The idea that Russia is going to conquer all of Ukraine and then conquer Eastern Europe is a laughable argument. It's laughable. They do not have the military capability to do that. And
but
by
what
the way,
makes this argument so attractive for the, let's say, the American establishment?
Because the governments in Europe and the mainstream media in Europe and the government in the United States and the mainstream media in the United States have become incredibly sophisticated at propagandizing, right? And this is why large numbers of people, certainly me and large numbers of people that I hang around with, do not believe what we read in the mainstream media or what the government says, because they lie all the time. And you hear these stories about, Russia on the march and conquering Europe, and you just sort of scratch your head and say, have you noticed that the Russian army is having a devil of a time trying to conquer the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine? This war has been going on for over 2 years now, and the Russians have not fully conquered all of the 4 oblasts that they've annexed. Just think about that. How is an army that had that kind of trouble going to conquer, occupy, and then integrate all of Ukraine into a greater Russia? And then how is an army that has had trouble conquering the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine going to conquer countries in Eastern Europe? And just to take this a step further, you've surely noticed that Europeans are not spending much money on defense. Europeans are not building formidable military establishments that could deter or fight against this so-called Goliath in the East that they're supposed to worry about. The reason that Europeans are not spending a lot of money on defense is because they know deep down there is no threat. Germany would be spending lots of money on defense if they thought that Russia was going to conquer Germany or conquer Poland. But they don't really believe that. They know that these claims about this Russian juggernaut are just propaganda. This is the world that we live in. It's hard to believe anything that the Dutch government or the US government or NATO leaders say.
Yeah, because Mark Rutte, the current Secretary General and our previous Prime Minister, said that if we don't step up our investments in defense, within 4 or 5 years, we have to learn Russian.
This is delusional. This guy lives on a different planet than I live on. I don't know what to say. You know, I just listen to these people talk, and I wonder what world they live in.
Well, you hear the Poles and the Baltic states say the same thing, of course. And they invest in their military and in their defense much more than we do in Holland.
Well, they have more reason to be concerned, right? There's a legitimate reason to be concerned because they live right next door to Russia. And they should do everything they can to make sure that if things go south, they're prepared to deal with the situation. But I would note that there is no evidence that Russia is going to threaten them at this point in time. Again, the Russians do not have the capability to invade a country like Poland. They don't have the capability or the interest to conquer all of Ukraine. Putin has never said that he was interested in conquering all of Ukraine, and he doesn't have the capability to do that. And furthermore, he'd be nuts to do that. I just want to remind you that the Soviet Union occupied a huge chunk of Europe from 1945 to 1989. We all know this. This is the Cold War. And the Soviet Union, occupied places like East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so forth and so on. The German occupation of those countries was a nightmare for the Soviet occupation of those countries was a nightmare for the Soviet Union. They had to put down an insurrection in East Germany in 1953. They had to invade Hungary in 1956. They had to invade Czechoslovakia in 1968. They almost had to invade Poland 3 times, except the Polish Communist Party put the trouble down. And then there were countries like Albania and Romania, which gave them constant headaches. Do you think the Russians today want to repeat that experience? You think they want to go into all these countries and try to occupy them? They would meet great resistance. This is the problem they face if they go into Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who hate Russians. If Russia conquers Western Ukraine, what do you think those ethnic Ukrainians are going to do? You think they're going to throw up their hands and say, oh, we're glad the Russians are here. We want to be part of a greater Russia? Of course not. What they're going to do is they're going to resist. The Russians are going to face a giant insurrection. Putin is a very smart guy. He'd be crazy to invade Western Ukraine, much less try to conquer Eastern Europe or the Netherlands or Germany.
Yeah, but John, you also didn't expect Putin to, in the end, invade Ukraine, right, in 22.
Look, I said, starting in 2014, right, that if NATO persisted in bringing Ukraine into the alliance, that this was going to lead to conflict, that the Russians were not going to sit down and take it. And again, Angela Merkel said in April 2008 that she understood that bringing Ukraine into NATO was a declaration of war. So there was all sorts of evidence that by 2022, early 2022, war was on the horizon. And what did we do in the West? What did the United States do? Did we try to work out a deal to avoid war? We did not do that at all. We did. When Putin wrote a letter on December 17th, 2021, this is roughly 2 months before the war started, to the West, proposing terms for some sort of agreement to avoid a war, the United States basically refused to negotiate over that letter. And we were saying at the same time, war is likely. You remember the United States government was predicting the war before it happened.
Right, yeah.
What did we do to avoid the war?
Macron
The
tried
answer
it.
is nothing. And then when the war broke out, Putin sent, immediately after the war broke out, Putin sent a message to the Ukrainians that he wanted to negotiate a settlement to stop the war. And as you know, negotiations started in Belarus, then they moved to Istanbul. And those negotiations were making excellent progress. You
And
did
then
not
Boris
have
Johnson came.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly.
So he was sent, you think, to sabotage these negotiations?
He was sent. He was sent. He was glad to go, I'm sure.
Yeah.
He's a super hawk. He's a Russophobe of the first order. And he, like most people in the West at the time, thought that Ukraine could win the war. That's why they told the Ukrainians to walk away from the deal, because they thought that Ukraine, with Western support, would defeat Russia and knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. And they were wrong. It was a catastrophic decision. Again, NATO, and here we're talking mainly about the United States. It's important to emphasize that the United States bears principal responsibility for this disaster. The Europeans were fools for going along with the Americans, but it's the Americans who are in the driver's seat. And the Americans were very interested in those negotiations in Istanbul not working out because we wanted to continue the fight. And we thought we would win. You want to remember that in the fall of 2022, the war is not 1 year old at the time, the Ukrainians are doing very well on the battlefield. And General Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, says that now is the time to cut a deal because this is the high water mark for Ukraine. It only gets worse for Ukraine, Milley says, because he understands that Putin is now mobilizing the economy and mobilizing troops to increase the size and skills of the Russian army. So Milley says, let's settle it now. The White House says, no way. We've got the Russians on the run and we're going to finish them off. And of course, the Europeans go along with this because the Europeans believe all these delusional ideas that the Ukrainians and the Americans are fostering. And the end result is the war continues. But what happens is that General Milley was right. And in the year 2023, and certainly in 2024, the balance of power shifts against Ukraine and in favor of the Russians. And we're now in a situation where it appears that the Russians are going to win a big victory.
Yeah, interesting. Let's now discuss the Middle East, because that's also, of course, the hot topic. We already alluded to it at the start. And maybe first the role of Turkey, because what's going on in Syria, it seems like the Turks want to sort of reestablish some sort of Ottoman empire, or at least they want to expand their borders. That's what they're doing in Syria. Israel is doing the same thing. Israel's, of course, joined at the hip with the US, but the US and Turkey are NATO partners. How is that going to play out in Syria?
Syria is a real mess. I mean, you not only have the Israelis in Syria and the Turks in Syria, the Americans are in Syria. And the Americans and the Turks have very different interests. In fact, they have conflicting interests because one of the reasons the Turks are so interested in Syria is because of the Syrian Kurds, who are mortal enemies from Turkey's point of view. But the Syrian Kurds are America's closest ally inside of Turkey. So you have this conflict, potential conflict between the United States and Turkey inside of Syria involving the Kurds. And then you have, as you point out, a potential conflict between between Turkey and Israel. The Turks have recently, here we're talking about President Erdogan. President Erdogan has recently said that Israel has to get out of Syria. It has to abandon that territory that it conquered. I wouldn't bet a lot of money that the Israelis are going to leave Syria, certainly the part of the Golan Heights that they recently occupied, anytime soon. So you're going to have the Israelis in Syria, the Turks in Syria. The Americans are in Syria. The Syrians, by the way, are working hard to keep the Russians in Syria. And on top of that, I wouldn't be surprised if Iran reestablishes good relations with the new regime in Damascus. And the Iranians may be back and involved in Syria. So Syria is a giant mess, and there's just all sorts of potential for conflict.
Why would this be favorable for the new Syrian government to reestablish good relations with Iran?
Well, the fact is that the new Syrian government does not have many friends. The Americans are an adversary. The Israelis are an adversary. The Turks are a mixed blessing. And the question you have to ask yourself is, if you are in charge in Damascus today, who are you going to turn for help? Who are you going to ask for help? Who's going to give you military and economic assistance?
Well, the guys who gave you weapons before.
Say that again?
The guys who gave you the weapons in the first place.
And who was that?
Well, they are going to look for nations or actors who will give them weapons anywhere, I suppose, and who will support them to stay in power.
Yes, but again, who is that? Who are those nations? I mean, I think except for the Turks, who's going to back the government in Damascus? You think the Americans are? You think the Americans are going to take sanctions off of the Syrian government? You think so? No. I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that. You think the Americans are going to give back the oil fields that they now control and the wheat fields that they now control in the eastern part of Syria? I don't think so. The Syrian government is going to hurt. It's going to really hurt. And it's going to try and get the Israelis out, and the Israelis are not going to leave. And the Israelis are continuing to bomb military assets in Syria. And in fact, it was just recently that they attacked government forces, the existing government forces. So the new government in Syria has real problems with the United States. It has real problems with Israel. And those two, as Paul said, are joined at the hip. The Turks will help them, that's for sure. Why are they trying to keep the Russians in? They're trying to keep the Russians in because they understand, the leaders in Damascus, they need all the help they can get.
Yeah, they're hedging their bet.
And that may mean Iran. There's evidence that the Iranians are talking to the new Syrian government. And I'm just saying, I don't know how this will play out over time. I wouldn't be surprised if the Iranians get re-involved in Syria moving forward. It's a real possibility.
Yeah, so Syria can become the mother of all proxy wars and a sort of a Libya on steroids.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right.
Yeah. Well, maybe also a little bit about the conflict between Israel and Hamas, because I know you guys have opposing opinions on that one. Because, John, you've said on multiple occasions that Israel's committing genocide. Is that correct?
Oh, sure. I mean, Amnesty International has said that. Human Rights Watch has said that. The International Court of Justice has said that there is evidence to make a plausible case at this point in time. All sorts of individuals have said that. Omer Bartov, who is an Israeli himself and who's one of the leading scholars on the Holocaust, has said that. I do believe it's a genocide. And if it's not a genocide, it's mass murder.
That's based on what exactly, John? On which data? Because the data are coming from, Hamas and from out of Gaza. So how can we trust them? How do we know that this is actually taking place?
Oh, I think that the data which is coming out from Hamas underestimates the numbers. The New York Times just had a big story. The Hamas numbers are actually too low. Furthermore, you, I think, should look at the the Amnesty International report. You should look at the Human Rights Report, these two reports on Israeli genocide. Those reports are filled with data that make the argument that this is a genocide. This is not a superficial charge that these prestigious human rights organizations are making. These are well-documented studies. And furthermore, if you look at the brief that the South African government filed before the International Court of Justice, this was in December of 2023, late December 2023, it's filled with evidence to support the charge. But if you don't want to call it genocide, that's fine. What do you call it? Mass murder? Is that your term? What's the term?
No, it depends probably on where you start. If you start from the from the idea that Israel has the right to defend itself, and that the October 7th was a massacre and was a disaster, and Israel had to react, and that fighting an urban war against a guerrilla or terrorist organization that hides in between civilians, it's a very difficult task, isn't it? And then you risk also hitting civilians and killing civilians. And I mean, as a realist, probably this is a fact that I would accept, that urban war, this comes with urban warfare, where terrorists are hiding between civilians in schools, in basements, in hospitals. And let me ask you, how do you fight a war like this without also killing civilians and hurting civilians?
Well, Wierd, just on the point that Israel has the right to defend itself, especially given what happened on October 7th, nobody denies that, right? Of course it has the right to defend itself. Every country has the right to defend itself, but that's not an interesting issue. The question is how you go about defending yourself. Just because you're attacked and you're defending yourself doesn't give you the right to execute a genocide. I think you would surely agree with that. Well, the question here
But how do you go after Hamas then?
Well, you go to great lengths to concentrate on targeting Hamas and doing what you can to minimize civilian casualties. And if you look at what the Israelis have been saying, and if you look at what they have been doing, they're not interested in minimizing civilian casualties. They're interested in maximizing civilian casualties. And they're basically interested in driving the Palestinians out of Gaza. This is an ethnic cleansing exercise. And what the Israelis thought they could do was they thought they could murder large numbers of Palestinians and drive them out of Gaza. And they thought they could starve them to death and use that as an instrument for driving them out of Gaza as well. If you look at the damage they have inflicted on Gaza, it goes well beyond the claim that they were interested in going after Hamas, and that this is just collateral damage. They've destroyed virtually every university or college in Gaza. They've been tearing up cemeteries. They've been destroying libraries and mosques. They've been shooting up hospitals. There are hardly any functioning hospitals in Gaza. They've not been letting in aid in the form of food, gas, and water, and medicine in anywhere near the sufficient amounts to keep large chunks of the population.
Well, there's different stories on the aid getting in or not getting in, and by whom is sabotaging the aid getting in. So there's different narratives on what's happening.
There's an Israeli narrative, and then there's the narrative from all the people in the United Nations and the aid groups that are in there as to what's happening. And those two narratives that are at odds. And the question is, who do you believe? And I wouldn't believe the Israelis.
Well, I would not intend to believe UNRWA, which is, also collaborating with Hamas. So there's, let's say that we're disagreeing on parts of this story, probably.
Well, it's not just UNRWA. It's all sorts of aid organizations that are in there who say that the Israelis are making it almost impossible to get the essential foodstuffs and medicine and water and gas or fuel into Gaza.
But anyway, we agree, of course, on that. That's a disaster what's happening over there, and there will be, like any conflict, there will be an end to this conflict also by negotiations. We see this perhaps happening now. But what kind of future will Gaza have? What kind of future will the Palestinians have after this war? And where will it be? I mean, where will the Palestinians live?
Well, I think there are two dimensions to this. One is we should talk a bit about the ceasefire, and that's now being negotiated, and it looks like it will be implemented on Sunday. And then we should talk about the long term, whether the ceasefire holds or not. First of all, the ceasefire is a huge defeat for Israel. It's really quite remarkable. At the end of the ceasefire, the Israelis have agreed to leave Gaza. They will leave Gaza completely. Furthermore, Hamas has not been defeated. And in fact, there are all sorts of articles in the Israeli press, right, that say that Hamas has reconstituted itself and it is as formidable a fighting force today as it was at the start of the war on October 7th. This is really quite remarkable.
It's difficult to believe also.
Pardon?
This is also difficult to believe. Where will they get their weapons from? I mean, there's thousands of them killed. The system of tunnels is, at least a big part, has been destroyed. So how can Hamas be the formidable force that they were before this all started?
You can go to the Jerusalem Post. You can go to the Israel Times. You can listen to Tony Blinken talk. And they basically said what I just said to you. This is not something I've made up. Right?
I understand. It's the Israeli newspaper, the Israeli media who's saying this. Yeah. But I think for us, it's difficult to believe, to state this as a fact.
Why should it be difficult for you to believe? There are huge numbers of young males in Gaza, and you can kill a couple thousand Hamas fighters, and there are plenty of young males who can replace them. In terms of the weaponry it's involved, Hamas relies on unsophisticated weapons. It's not like they have tanks and airplanes, right? They rely on anti-tank weapons. They rely on rifles, explosive devices, and so forth and so on. And they have plenty of them. They can build them inside of Gaza. And furthermore, there's all sorts of evidence that there's lots of unexploded Israeli ordnance lying around in Gaza that Hamas is using to make bombs that are very effective against the Israelis. So the argument that people are making, and again, this is not me, this is people inside of Israel who are loyal to the government, that Hamas is in very good shape today. But again, it's not only that, it's the fact that the ceasefire agreement, assuming that it's implemented, calls for Israel to leave. To abandon the Philadelphia corridor, which is the line between Gaza and Egypt that the Israelis have said they have to occupy for the long term. Now they've agreed to leave. They've agreed to allow food and other kinds of aid to come in. They've allowed Palestinians to return to their homes, which means that the effort to ethnically cleanse North Gaza, which looked like it was going to happen a few weeks ago, is not going to happen because all those people.
What happened? What made the Israelis do this? Agree with this?
Trump?
No, well, I think Trump mattered for sure. But the other thing is the Israeli army is in real trouble, right? The fact is the Israelis, number one, cannot defeat Hamas in Gaza, right? Number two, they have been suffering severe casualties in Gaza. Third, the Israeli army is in real trouble. They're having great difficulty getting reservists to report for duty. Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, had a big story on this the other day, the state of the Israeli army, and you see it in other media outlets in Israel as well. The army is in trouble. Remember, the army is in Syria, the army is in southern Lebanon, the army is in Gaza. This is an army that's not used to fighting long wars. It's not constituted to fight long wars, and it's been fighting in Gaza since October 7th, 2023, and it's, again, now involved in other places like Syria and southern Lebanon as well. So the army is running out of gas, and Hamas is alive and well. So it makes sense from Israel's point of view to cut a deal, and that's what they've done. But that's just the short term. The question is, what's the long term? And the long term is Israel will continue to exist as an apartheid state. And the problem that it faces is that more people around the world understand that Israel is an apartheid state, and they also understand that Israel has executed a genocide, or if you want to use your view of it, mass murder, not a genocide. This is a huge stain on
fought
Israel.
a war. In my words, it will be Israel fought a war.
Oh, fought a war. Okay. So you think that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are doing what? What do you think is going on when they accuse Israel of genocide? You think they're just anti-Semites?
No, but I think, well, as I said, I think it's a very complicated way of fighting a war in an urban zone like this, where terrorists are hiding in schools and in hospitals, etc. And yes, probably there will be disproportional number of civilians getting hit and killed also. But I don't see any other way to fight this war. But this is difference of opinion how to deal with this problem. More interesting is what you were saying about the long term, how to evade something like this to happen again in the long term. And that's what would interest me.
Well, you're going to have, as I said, the continuation of an apartheid state. Israel's going to remain an apartheid state. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what are the oppressed people in that apartheid state going to do? And the fact is, they're going to continue to resist.
Because then we're talking about the West Bank and Gaza.
West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing you want to remember is that the number of Palestinians inside of Greater Israel is roughly the same number as the number of Israeli Jews. By my count, you have about 7.3 million Israeli Jews and 7.3 million Palestinians inside of Greater Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
The question,
not Greater Gaza, but the whole of Israel, you mean?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Greater Israel.
Yeah,
yes, inside Greater Israel. And the question is, given those numbers and given that you have an apartheid state, where does this all lead?
Well, it's a demographical time bomb for the Israelis.
That's right. And that's why they were trying to ethnically cleanse Gaza. That's why they were murdering all those people, contrary to what you said. Mm-hmm. You want to understand that the Israelis understand that they live in an apartheid state. The Israelis don't understand what happened to South Africa. They understand that an apartheid state is not sustainable over the long term, and they have to fix the problem. And the only way they see to fix the problem is to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza and out of the West Bank. And if they can't do that, they'll murder them all.
Right. Paul.
Okay, guys, I think we can agree to disagree on this particular topic, but it's very interesting to see you guys debate this issue in a very well-mannered way. Let's try to wrap up. We've been talking for almost an hour. Last time when we ended, John, you only had negative words. Now, my question to you would be like, is there a way out of, like, when I read offensive realism, I read about the escalation ladder, and it seems like things can only get worse if great states follow your theory because they want to be stronger. They live in uncertain times. There is no night watchman, so the only incentive they have is to become stronger and to boost their armies. But at the same time, we saw during the Cold War also a period of detente. We saw with the START treaties that the world was able to come together and reduce the nuclear stockpile. So what's the way forward for humanity? And can we sort of beat your offensive realism strategy or theory? Is that possible at all?
Well, I think that great powers will compete with each other forever, in large part because you live in an anarchic international system. There is just no higher authority. So great power competition is inevitable. But as you pointed out in your comments, sometimes that competition is less fierce than it is at other times. And during the Cold War, for example, we did have a significant period of détente, and that is possible. I would argue that cooperation and détente always take place in the shadow of competition. The competition defines relations between the great powers in large part. But I think it's very important that the United States and China both go to great lengths to recognize the fact that they are in an intense security competition and that there is a real potential for war, and that they go to great lengths to ameliorate that competition as much as possible and avoid war. I think with regard to the United States and the Russians, right, I think the Americans should recognize that there is no reason for them to have a meaningful security competition with Russia. Russia's not a serious threat to the United States. If anything, the Americans should be allied with the Russians against the Chinese. I've long argued this. But of course, that's not been our policy. So I think at least for the foreseeable future, for the reasons I described in our discussion, you're going to have trouble between the United States and Russia. And of course, you're going to have trouble between the United States and China. The Middle East is a completely different situation. I see very little hope there. One subject that we haven't talked about, by the way, which is of enormous importance, is the question of whether the United States and Israel will attack Iran. You want to remember, the Israelis are in real trouble in Gaza. That was the point that I made to Wierd, that they're in trouble in Gaza. But in my opinion, the greatest threat to Israel is the fact that Iran is very close to being able to develop a nuclear weapon. That's the nightmare scenario for Israel. And of course, Israel wants the United States to help it attack Iran and eliminate this problem. And that is a huge issue that's not going to go away anytime soon. And that will be a big issue that the Trump administration has to deal with. So if you look around the world and you think about what the situation is in East Asia with regard to the US-China rivalry, you think of the problems we have shutting down the war in Ukraine and bringing some sort of peace to Europe. And then you think about Gaza and you think about a possible war against Iran. And then you think about what's going on in Syria and how we talked about the future in Syria. You see that there is just trouble almost everywhere you look. And it's hard to tell a happy story without my realist theory or with my realist.
Yeah,
a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. But then if you follow your theory, go ahead, finish your sentence.
Go ahead, Paul.
No, I was wondering, like, if you follow your theory, would it then make sense from a U.S. and Israel point of view to preemptively strike Iran to decapitate their nuclear capabilities?
They can't do that. First of all, it's not clear that they could go in. Let me start over. It's the Israelis cannot take out Iran's nuclear capabilities by themselves. With regard to the Americans, it's not clear that we can take them out. We may be able to do that, but it is a really difficult task because the Iranians have buried a lot of their capability inside a mountain that is hard to attack. But let's assume that we, the Americans, can take out Iran's nuclear capability. Almost everybody agrees that the Iranians will then dig deeper into the ground and develop their nuclear weapons in a more surreptitious way, and they will eventually get nuclear weapons. The idea that you can stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons forever is delusional. It's not possible. And almost everybody I know who studies this subject says that. You know, when the Soviet Union exploded a nuclear weapon in 1949, the United States gave a lot of thought to attacking the Soviets' nuclear capability and preventing them from getting nuclear weapons, period, end of story. It was very tempting for obvious reasons. And we never did it. And the reason we never did it is we understood that even if we took out their capabilities in the short term, over the long term, they'd develop nuclear weapons. And the same thing was true with China. Both the United States and the Soviet Union thought about attacking China's nuclear installations once it was clear they were going down the nuclear weapons road. And neither country did it because we understood it wouldn't work over the long term. And the same thing is true with regard to Iran. Even if you could take out their capabilities, and it's not clear that we can, we meaning the Americans, you can't put an end to them forever. So there is no military solution here. But if we don't believe that, if we, the Americans, attack Iran, then you have a full-scale war in the Middle East between the United States and Iran, on top of all the other conflicts that we've talked about, such as the one that Israel has with Hamas, it has with Hezbollah, and what's going on in Syria, and so forth and so on.
Clear, John. You were about to say something, and then I interrupted you. So what did you want to add?
No, I just wanted to say, Paul, that if you think back to what the world looked like in the early 1990s, maybe even throughout the entire 1990s, the Americans and the Europeans thought that we had created this giant zone of peace, and it was going to expand over the globe, and we were all going to live happily ever after. This is the Frank Fukuyama message, that this is the end of history, that countries are becoming liberal democracies here, there, and everywhere. We have the wind at our back. And you remember, Fukuyama says at the end of his famous piece on the end of history that the biggest problem we'll face moving forward is boredom. If you think about that world and where we are today, if you think about the world that Donald Trump is inheriting, I do not envy Donald Trump. He's really enthusiastic about being president again. But if he thinks long and hard about the problems facing him, it's hard to see how he can be anything but categorically depressed. Because there are so many problems, and there don't appear to be solutions to hardly any of these problems. Really depressing.
It is. Absolutely. Wierd, maybe your final chance to, in this conversation at least, to ask one more question to John.
Well, I was thinking that I was living as a correspondent in the 90s in Russia, and there was no way of Russian thinking like Francis Fukuyama tried to argue. So their world was still the same, and it is still the same probably as it is today. And the way their outlook on geopolitics and the way the role that Russia should play in the world, and that's the problem, of course, that most people do not understand, powers like Russia and China. And, my question would be, in your ideal realistic world, John, how would these powers, like Russia as a regional power, China as an upcoming superpower, America as a superpower, then Europe somewhere in between, how would they interact with each other? How would there be peace between those powers who, of course, in history, it always ended in a war. So how can we avoid this? How can we avoid a war between America and China, for instance?
Well, I would point out to you, Wierd, that the U.S.-Soviet competition during the Cold War did not end up in a war.
That's true.
We never directly engaged each other in a fight, and then the Soviet Union ended the Cold War peacefully in 1989. And it fell apart in December 1991. And my view on the U.S.
But you could say that the war in Ukraine is the outcome also of that Cold War, right? That became a hot war again, and now we're fighting this Americans are fighting this proxy war in Ukraine with the Russians.
Well, you probably won't agree with this, Wierd, and I fully appreciate that. But my view is that the war in Ukraine is the result of foolish NATO policy, and to be more specific, foolish American policy. I do believe, and I cannot emphasize this point enough, I do believe that had the decision not been made in April 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO, that there would not be a war in Ukraine today, and that Ukraine would be intact to include all of Crimea. I do not believe Putin was itching to conquer Crimea, or that he was itching to conquer any other territory in Ukraine before February 2014. And I believe that what has caused this aggressive Russian behavior was NATO's foolish policy to decide to incorporate Ukraine into NATO.
Well, I agree with you mostly on your analysis of the conflict in Ukraine, but but initially, of course, I more or less asked you how would an ideal, realistic world, what would be your ideal, realistic world in which these powers have their own zones of influence and exist with each other in peace?
Well, my argument is that great powers never exist with each other in a state of peace, right? What they do is they compete with each other. And that competition can be at a high level. It can be an intense security competition, or it can be a less intense security competition. For example, you can have a détente between two great powers. And in my opinion, what the United States wants to do is make sure that it does not get involved in an intense security competition with China that leads to a war. I think there's a real danger of that. Just there was a real danger of a war between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But we should work to avoid that. But the idea that you're going to get peace between the United States and China, the idea that the United States and China are going to live happily ever after, that relations between the United States and China are going to look like they did during the 1990s or in the early 2000s, I don't think that's going to happen. I think once China became a great power, which in my opinion happened around 2017, that from that point forward, the United States and China were destined as great powers to engage in security competition. So I don't think in terms of a peaceful world. I just think in terms of a world where security competition is ever present among the great powers, but nevertheless, it is possible for them to not end up in a shooting war with each other.
I would say the absence of a shooting war is peace in my eyes, but that's a matter of definition. Okay, Paul.
Well, okay, that's a perfectly legitimate definition. I don't use that definition, but I think given your definition, then we're in basic agreement.
I think so, yeah.
Well, let's hope for that then. So again, no bedtime stories from your side, John, today. Very realistic, somewhat pessimistic, but very clear outlook of what's going to happen perhaps over the next few months. And it's going to be very tough for Trump indeed. Let me express how grateful I am, John, for you making time again for me. And also Wierd, of course, for you to join this episode. I think it was very interesting. I loved your debate too, very lively and decent. So thanks to the both of you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you to both of you. And I actually enjoyed debating with Wierd. I think one of the problems that we faced in Western society today is that we don't have enough respectful debates among people who disagree on fundamental issues. And I think it's very important to have those debates. There's nothing wrong with two people like Wierd and me disagreeing about what's going on in Gaza. But it's very important for us to talk about it. And we need more of that these days.
Thank you, John. I agree with you.
Yeah, fully agree with that, John. Any final remarks from your end, John, or should we call it a wrap?
I think I've said everything I have to say. I can't think of anything that I left on the table.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot, John. And perhaps we can do it again next year.
I'd love to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you both.